I've always believed in respecting people's rights to live as they choose, but lately I find myself caught in a strange paradox. The more I try to support freedom and equality, the more I feel I'm being told to abandon common sense. That's where satire becomes my tool. Not to mock or belittle people, but to hold a mirror up to society and ask, have we gone too far? When I said, I can identify as a black lesbian, it wasn't because I believe that's a legitimate identity for me. It was to highlight the absurdity of where this ideological spiral can lead when taken to extremes. It began as a conversation about gender, but it quickly evolved into something far broader, a challenge to the very concept of identity itself. I'm not black, I'm not a woman, I'm not a lesbian. And yet, in today's social climate, if someone makes those claims, many believe it's bigoted or offensive to question them. That's not progressive thinking, that's intellectual tyranny. We've reached a place where facts are becoming optional and feelings are treated as sacred truths beyond examination. There's a significant difference between empathy and surrender. I have deep empathy for people who struggle with gender dysphoria or who feel marginalized because of who they are. But empathy should never require me, or anyone else, to abandon reason or objective reality. When I use satir to claim an identity I clearly don't possess, I wasn't trying to offend anyone. I was asking a necessary question: where does self-identification stop being valid and start being delusional? I've always admired how humor and satire have the power to expose contradictions in society. George Carlin did it. Ricky Gervais does it. Even Dave Chappelle, who's faced intense backlash, does it in his own raw, unapologetic way. My approach is no different. If we can't laugh at ourselves or question the logic of ideologies we promote, we risk creating a culture where fear replaces honesty. And once fear takes over, truth becomes irrelevant. We're living in an age where institutions, universities, media, even governments are walking on eggshells. The desire to be inclusive has morphed into a dangerous fear of exclusion. It's no longer enough to tolerate differences. We must affirm all identities without question, even when they contradict science, history, or observable reality. And if we dare to ask questions, we're branded as transphobic, racist, sexist, or worse. That's not how a healthy society operates. That's how cults maintain control. I don't believe anyone should be discriminated against for their gender identity. But I also believe that men are not women and women are not men. Biology matters. Facts matter. And if someone feels differently inside, that's something I can respect and empathize with, but it doesn't mean the external world must rearrange itself entirely around their internal perceptions. When I made that statement about identifying as a black lesbian, I wasn't trivializing real struggles. I was highlighting the slippery slope of an ideology that refuses to recognize boundaries. If I can identify as anything I want, without challenge, without evidence, then identity becomes meaningless. If we can't say that some things are objectively true, then eventually nothing is, and that is a terrifying prospect for any rational thinker. Some say that satire like mine is harmful or dismissive. I disagree. I think it opens the door for honest dialogue. If people are offended, maybe it's because the satire strikes a nerve. And perhaps that nerve deserves to be examined. Why does it bother us to hear something that forces us to confront contradictions in our beliefs? Why are we more concerned with tone than with truth? I know some will say I'm punching down, but in reality I'm punching up at a powerful cultural force that demands silence and submission. I'm speaking up for people who feel they can't express doubt or skepticism without being vilified. People who whisper their concerns in private because they're afraid of losing their jobs, their reputations, even their friends. That's not freedom. That's fear masquerading as tolerance. Identity politics started with good intentions to protect and uplift marginalized communities. But now it's being weaponized. It's no longer about inclusion, it's about control. It's about telling people what they're allowed to say, think, or believe. It's about shutting down dissent and enforcing ideological purity. And satire is one of the last defenses we have against that kind of dogma. So when I challenge identity politics through satire, I do it not to mock the vulnerable, but to confront the powerful. I do it to preserve the right to think critically, to question popular narratives, and to protect the integrity of truth itself. If we lose the ability to draw lines between fact and fiction, between empathy and surrender, then we lose the very foundation of reasoned debate. My message isn't that people don't deserve respect. My message is that respect doesn't require me to myself or deny reality. It's possible to be compassionate without being complicit in falsehoods. It's possible to honor someone's personal journey without reading biology or redefining language. And it's absolutely necessary to keep asking questions, even if the answers makes people uncomfortable. Because once we stop asking questions, we stop being free. Woke culture began with good intentions, a movement meant to bring awareness to systemic injustice, social inequality, and historical wrongs. But over time, what once championed fairness and understanding has, in many cases, transformed into a rigid ideological machine that punishes dissent, polices thought, and demands absolute conformity. It's no longer a conversation rooted in empathy and progress. It has become a culture of fear, censorship, and division where disagreement is mistaken for hate and nuance is drowned out by outrage. Everyone looks, from universities to media platforms to corporate boardrooms. There is a growing pressure to adopt a very specific worldview. It's not enough to be neutral. Silence is interpreted as violence, and failing to post the right hashtags or recite the approved language can get someone shamed or even cancelled. This creates an environment where people are not encouraged to think, but are coerced into compliance. It is no longer about equality of opportunity or mutual respect. It's about ideological purity, and anyone who questions the dominant narrative is immediately labeled ignorant, bigoted, or worse. The irony of woke culture is that, while it claims to be inclusive and progressive, it often behaves in deeply exclusionary and regressive ways. It doesn't foster open dialogue. It shuts it down. People who raise legitimate concerns or pose critical questions about issues like gender identity, race dynamics, or political policy are shouted down, deplatformed, or labeled as reactionaries. In this climate, truth becomes secondary to emotional affirmation, and facts are often sacrificed in favor of preserving a preferred narrative. There is a growing intolerance within this movement for any perspective that does not perfectly align with its own values. Even allies of progressive causes are being eaten by the very ideology they once supported. One misstep, one poorly worded comment, one opinion slightly out of line, and a person can be publicly humiliated and cast out. There is no room for learning, forgiveness, or context. Only punishment. This is not justice. It is authoritarianism in moral disguise. People are losing their jobs for things they said years ago, being boycotted for comedy routines, or being silenced for defending science or expressing personal beliefs. Instead of engaging in respectful disagreement, woke culture thrives on mob justice and cancel campaigns. The individual is reduced to a single comment or post, stripped of complexity or humanity. And in this rush to be offended, real conversations about difficult issues are lost. This culture thrives on virtuous signaling, performative expressions of morality that are more about appearing righteous than being righteous. People publicly declare their support for the latest social cause, often without a real understanding of it, just to avoid criticism or to feel morally superior. It's a culture that rewards outrage over insight, performance over principle. People aren't changing their minds, they're just adjusting their behavior out of fear. The rise of this mindset also distorts the meaning of fundamental values like tolerance, equality, and justice. Tolerance now means tolerating only those who agree. Equality has become about forced outcomes rather than equal opportunities. Justice is seen not as fairness under law, but as retribution against groups considered historically privileged, regardless of individual responsibility. In trying to correct injustice, woke culture often creates new injustices. It also thrives on language manipulation, where terms are constantly redefined or weaponized. Words like violence, trauma, or safety are no longer used in their traditional sense, but are stretched to include mere disagreement or emotional discomfort. This blurs the line between real harm and intellectual discomfort. Disagreeing with someone's opinion is not an act of violence. Questioning a cultural trend is not hate speech. But in the world of woke orthodoxy, intent no longer matters, only perception. This has deeply affected education, where students are taught what to think instead of how to think. Critical thinking is being replaced by ideological grooming. In many institutions, students are discouraged from exploring opposing views and are instead taught to see disagreement as dangerous. This creates echo chambers rather than spaces for intellectual growth. The purpose of education should be to broaden minds, not to police them. Woke culture also stifles creativity. Artists, comedians, and writers now self-censor to avoid controversy. The result is a cultural landscape that feels increasingly sanitized, predictable, and inauthentic. Great art often challenges, offends, and provokes thought, but in an era where offending someone can end a career, fewer people are willing to take that risk. This diminishes not just the arts, but society's ability to grapple with complex truths through storytelling. The problem isn't with the desire to make the world a better place. That desire is noble. The problem is with the methods being used and the mentality being promoted. A culture that relies on fear and shame to enforce its values will never truly persuade or unify. It will only create silence, resentment, and division. A true progress happens not through forced agreement, but through honest, respectful conversation, even when it's uncomfortable. What's needed is a return to balance. We must be able to care about justice without becoming zealots. We must recognize systemic problems without vilifying entire groups. And we must defend free thought even when it challenges the prevailing view. Otherwise, the culture that claims to fight oppression may end up becoming the very thing it once opposed. Freedom of speech is one of the most fundamental pillars of any democratic society. It allows individuals to express their thoughts, challenge authority, and engage in open discourse without fear of government censorship. Historically, this right has been fiercely defended as a means of promoting truth, intellectual progress, and accountability. However, in recent years, a new form of censorship has emerged, not from the state, but from society itself. It is not law that silences people, but the weight of social pressure, the fear of backlash, and the threat of being publicly shamed or ostracized. This shift raises important questions about whether freedom of speech can truly exist in a culture where people are punished not by legal force, but by public opinion for expressing dissenting views. Social pressure has always existed, but in the digital age, its power has magnified. A single post, tweet, or comment can spark a viral outrage campaign. People are cancelled, doxxed, or boycotted not because they broke any law, but because they expressed an opinion that goes against the dominant narrative. In theory, individuals still have the right to speak, but in practice, they often self-censor to avoid reputational or professional consequences. This creates an environment where freedom of speech is technically protected, but not meaningfully practiced. This tension is most visible in debates surrounding culture, identity, politics, and morality. Topics like gender identity, race, religion, and sexuality have become emotionally charged battlegrounds. While these are serious and sensitive issues, the insistence on ideological conformity often shuts down nuanced discussion. People are told they must believe certain things, use specific language, and adopt particular viewpoints, or else be branded as hateful, ignorant, or regressive. The result is a climate of fear in which genuine questions and alternative perspectives are silenced. The difference between disagreement and suppression has become increasingly blurred. Expressing a controversial opinion is often seen not as part of healthy debate, but as an act of aggression. Language is policed, intent is ignored, and perception becomes the standard by which speech is judged. This makes it almost impossible to navigate difficult conversations without risk. Even those with thoughtful, well-reasoned arguments can find themselves under fire if their views do not align with mainstream expectations. The cost of speaking one's mind has become so high that many choose silence over honesty. In this atmosphere, freedom of speech loses its core value. It no longer serves as a tool for discovery, growth, or reconciliation. Instead, it becomes a landmine field where one wrong word can destroy reputations or careers. The chilling effect is real, especially in workplaces, universities, and public platforms. People speak in coded language, avoid certain topics altogether, or adopt the expected narrative simply to survive. While no law has been passed against speaking freely, the consequences imposed by social forces are often just as effective at silencing dissent. Ironically, the very platforms that were once celebrated as spaces for free expression, social media, universities, public forums, have become some of the most hostile environments for open dialogue. Algorithms reward outrage and emotional reactions, not thoughtful discourse. People are rewarded with likes and followers for joining the mob, not for standing up for unpopular truths. In this system, conformity becomes a currency and independent thought a liability. There is also a psychological toll. People who feel unable to speak honestly begin to experience isolation and disillusionment. They may disengage from public life, retreat into echo chambers, or grow resentful of a society that claims to value freedom while punishing expression. This fosters polarization, as people are driven into ideological corners rather than drawn into constructive exchange. Civil discourse deteriorates, and mutual understanding becomes harder to achieve. The role of institutions in this dynamic is significant. When employers, media outlets, and educational institutions prioritize reputation management over intellectual integrity, they contribute to a culture that discourages risk-taking and authentic communication. Employees fear speaking freely at work. Students worry about losing grades or facing disciplinary action. Journalists self-censor to avoid offending their audience. In such an environment, freedom of speech becomes a hollow concept, present on paper but absent in practice. There is also the question of double standards. Certain viewpoints are protected and celebrated, while others are demonized, even if expressed respectfully. This selective tolerance undermines the principle of free speech itself. True freedom means allowing speech that makes people uncomfortable, not just speech that confirms their beliefs. The test of a society's commitment to freedom lies not in its treatment of popular opinions, but in its handling of unpopular ones. The solution is not to remove all social accountability or allow hateful rhetoric to go unchecked. It is to restore balance, a culture where people can express differing opinions without fear of disproportionate retribution. It is to distinguish between real harm and mere disagreement. It is to foster resilience rather than hypersensitivity, open-mindedness rather than dogma. In the end, freedom of speech must be more than a legal protection. It must be a lived value. It must be defended not just from governments, but from mobs. Not just in law books, but in everyday interactions. Only then can it serve its true purpose, empowering individuals, challenging injustice, and driving societies forward through honest, sometimes uncomfortable dialogue. The tension between respect and reason has become one of the defining dilemmas of modern discourse. On one hand, society rightly demands compassion, empathy, and recognition of individual experiences. Respect for different identities, backgrounds, and personal struggles has become a core value in public and private life. On the other hand, reason, rooted in logic, science, and objective truth, remains essential to building a shared reality and making informed decisions. When these two values come into conflict, the result is confusion, censorship, and a growing inability to engage in honest debate. Respect is foundational to any civil society. It allows people to coexist peacefully despite their differences and encourages a culture of kindness. However, when respect becomes synonymous with unconditional agreement, it transforms into something else entirely. It shifts from being a moral principle to an ideological demand. In this form, respect is no longer about acknowledging another's dignity. It becomes a requirement to accept every personal belief or identity claim as equally valid, regardless of whether it aligns with observable reality or rational thought. Reason, on the other hand, demands evidence, consistency, and the willingness to question assumptions. It is through reason that society has advanced in medicine, technology, law, and ethics. Reason allows people to distinguish between what is true and what is merely believed to be true. It provides the framework for discussion, critique, and discovery. But increasingly, reason is being sidelined in favor of preserving feelings, avoiding offense, or promoting ideological uniformity. This conflict is especially apparent in debates around identity. While individuals should be treated with dignity and their struggles respected, reason calls for clear definitions and boundaries. When someone claims to be something they are biologically or factually not, the question arises, should society affirm the claim out of respect or challenge it out of reason? In many cases, even asking this question is seen as disrespectful. Yet, the inability to question without being labeled offensive limits the possibility of finding common understanding or truth. There is a growing insistence that to question someone's belief or identity is inherently disrespectful. This conflates disagreement with hatred and criticism with cruelty. In reality, a person can disagree without being disrespectful. It is possible to question ideas while respecting individuals. But when reason is treated as a form of oppression and respect is weaponized to silence opposing views, society loses its ability to think critically. Education, once the cornerstone of critical thinking, has increasingly become a battleground in this struggle. Students are often taught what to believe rather than how to think. Dissenting opinions are discouraged in the name of safety, and the mere act of raising logical questions can be interpreted as an act of aggression. The classroom, which should be a place of intellectual challenge and growth, risks becoming an echo chamber where feelings override facts and consensus is valued more than inquiry. Media and public discourse reflect this shift. Journalists, writers, and speakers walk a tightrope, trying not to offend while attempting to report or comment on complex issues. This has led to watered-down conversations where key points are avoided and inconvenient truths are ignored. The result is a population less informed, more emotionally reactive, and increasingly divided. The fear of being labeled disrespectful stifles meaningful discussion and fosters mistrust. In professional settings, the demand for respect has led to hypersensitivity. Workplace policies now often prioritize emotional comfort over open dialogue. Employees are expected to adhere to language codes and belief systems that may conflict with their personal views, or with objective facts. Speaking freely, even in good faith, can be seen as an act of insensitivity. This cultivates an environment where conformity is prioritized over competence and expression is suppressed in the name of harmony. The balance between respect and reason must be restored. Respect should never be used as a shield against scrutiny, nor should reason be used as an excuse for cruelty. They are not mutually exclusive. A society that values both can offer compassion without compromising truth and uphold dignity without abandoning critical thinking. Respect can guide the tone and intention of dialogue, while reason can guide the content and direction. To move forward, it is essential to foster resilience in both individuals and institutions. People must be encouraged to engage with ideas that challenge their worldview. Disagreement should not be feared, but embraced as a necessary part of growth. Respect must include the ability to listen without demanding total agreement. Likewise, reason must be tempered by empathy, recognizing the humanity of those involved in every conversation. Ultimately, a culture that values only respect risks becoming emotionally fragile and intellectually stagnant, while a culture that values only reason risks becoming cold and detached. The true strength of any society lies in its ability to integrate both, creating space for honest dialogue rooted in truth but delivered with care. When respect and reason work together, they do not weaken one another, they reinforce the possibility of genuine understanding and progress.